I stood frozen on the porch of my childhood home, a key in my hand that no longer fit. My heart thundered in my chest as the realization settled over me. The house was dark, unfamiliar. A realtor's sign stood starkly illuminated by the street lamp, announcing a pending sale I knew nothing about. My mother had sold our family home, my home, without even telling me. Before we begin the story, how old are you, and where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to know. Now, enjoy the story. I'm Emily, 32 years old, and betrayal is not a word I ever expected to associate with my own mother. But then again, expectations have always had a complicated history in our family. Standing there, staring blankly at that red sold sticker, I realized that in the shadows of love, betrayal often finds its perfect hiding place. My mother, Patricia, had always been a force. Sharp, poised, and immaculately dressed, she lived her life according to a strict set of expectations, both for herself and for me. Appearance mattered above all. Our home, a stately colonial on a quiet street lined with oak trees, was as carefully curated as the images we presented to the world. But behind closed doors, Patricia's standards were relentless, a quiet tyranny masked as maternal concern. When I was 12, my father died in a sudden car accident, leaving a silence in the house so thick it felt tangible. He had been my ally against my mother's high expectations, always reminding me softly, "Emily, perfection is overrated." But with his absence, Patricia's expectations only tightened, her fear of social judgment hardening into something colder, more critical. I carried the weight of her standards through adolescence and into adulthood, becoming everything she demanded: successful, composed, respectable. Yet beneath my polished exterior simmered a quiet rebellion. I built my career as a graphic designer not because it met her approval, but because it allowed me the freedom to quietly assert myself, to reclaim a small piece of my own identity. My grandfather, the only one who truly understood me after Dad's death, used to tell me, "You don't owe anyone a version of yourself that isn't true." His wisdom became my silent rebellion, a mantra I whispered each time Patricia's demands threatened to suffocate me. His death 2 years ago left another void in my life, yet he had left behind something concrete, a promise that when Patricia eventually sold the house, it would be mine. It was written clearly in his will, a clause Patricia and I both knew by heart. So why was I now standing locked out, sold out, and utterly in the dark? The week before, Patricia had casually invited me to dinner, an invitation so out of character that it should have triggered suspicion. We sat across from each other, the silence heavier than usual. Finally, she broke it, her voice oddly soft. She said, "Emily, have you considered moving? It might be good for you to start fresh somewhere new." I answered carefully, "My life is here, Mom. I have no reason to leave." She'd looked away, her eyes hardening with an emotion I couldn't quite place. Now, standing outside the house she had already stripped from me, I understood. It was guilt masked as concern. My first instinct was confrontation, anger fueling every step as I turned away from the darkened porch. But beneath the fury, something else stirred: calculation, quiet resolve. Patricia had always underestimated my strength, mistaking my silence for compliance. That mistake would be her undoing. As I walked away from the house, my steps echoing softly in the empty street, I knew I wouldn't scream or lash out. That wasn't me. Instead, I would turn my quiet anger into action. Patricia had betrayed more than just our shared past, she'd broken a promise made by someone we both loved deeply. This was no longer simply about a house or a childhood home, it was about honoring my grandfather's legacy, about holding my mother accountable in a way she never anticipated. The very next morning, after a sleepless night of careful thought, I contacted my lawyer. My voice steady, I explained the betrayal, the broken will, the house sold without consent. As I spoke, I felt a strange, powerful clarity. This was not just about the loss of bricks and mortar, this was about reclaiming myself from a lifetime of quiet erosion. He listened calmly, then asked quietly, "Are you sure, Emily? This will get ugly." I paused, letting his words sink in. The easy path had never been an option for me. After a lifetime spent in Patricia's shadow, quiet rebellion had become my second nature. Yes, I said finally, resolve hardening my voice. I'm sure. Days passed, and I moved through my life mechanically, my thoughts fixed on the upcoming confrontation. But Patricia didn't know I'd discovered her betrayal. She didn't yet realize the extent of what she'd unleashed. I kept our interactions cordial, betraying nothing of the storm gathering beneath my calm exterior. She, always so careful to control every interaction, remained oblivious to my quiet revolution. Then came the letter, a crisp legal notice delivered to Patricia's immaculate new apartment downtown. I imagined her reaction, the shock rippling across her composed facade, and felt a quiet satisfaction. For the first time, she would be forced to confront a consequence she couldn't dismiss or control. The day the legal proceedings began, I sat in the back of the courtroom, my hands folded carefully in my lap, my eyes fixed resolutely ahead. Patricia sat at the defendant's table, her posture rigid, her gaze furious and disbelieving. She turned to look at me once, eyes narrowing with a bitterness I'd never seen so plainly before. I met her gaze steadily, my expression calm, unyielding. She mouthed silently, accusingly, "How could you?" My only response was a slight, almost imperceptible nod. After years of silent acquiescence, this was my answer. I wasn't just fighting for a house, I was fighting for myself. As the judge began to speak, Patricia's shoulders stiffened further, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. I allowed myself a small, quiet breath. This was only the beginning. As the courtroom emptied, I stayed seated for a moment longer, breathing slowly, deliberately. Patricia had fled quickly, eyes averted, pride still holding her posture painfully erect. In the heavy quiet of that empty room, I felt the ghostly presence of my grandfather beside me, his silent strength reinforcing mine. He had always been the voice of reason amid Patricia's relentless expectations, gently countering her demands for perfection with soft words of acceptance. Even as a child, I'd gravitated toward his quiet solidity. While Patricia busied herself hosting parties or attending charity events to impress our suburban neighbors, my grandfather taught me how to garden, his hands thick with soil, guiding mine carefully as we planted roses behind the house. He often spoke in quiet, meaningful metaphors. "A garden is a reflection of life, Emily," he'd say gently, pruning away dead branches. "Sometimes, you must remove what's dying, no matter how beautiful it once was." My mother's demands were relentless, her standards impossible. Once, in high school, I brought home a report card full of A's except for a single B+. Patricia's response had been icy disappointment. She said, "I expect better, Emily. How will this look to others?" I replied softly, "Does it matter how it looks, or how it feels?" Her silence was more telling than her words. Perception was always her god, public image her religion. Anything less was a personal failure, mine and, by extension, hers. But my grandfather understood differently. During our Saturdays together, he quietly shared his own childhood, his struggles, poverty, and determination to rise above circumstances without losing his integrity. He taught me to read people as carefully as he read business ledgers, noting patterns, hidden truths. "People show you who they are, Emily," he would often remind me. "Believe them the first time." So, I'd watched Patricia carefully over the years, seen how she treated those she considered beneath her, felt her cold dismissal firsthand, and learned the quiet art of emotional survival. My grandfather's health began declining when I was 27. Patricia, uncomfortable with illness and weakness, distanced herself further, leaving his care largely to me. Late at night, I'd sit beside his hospital bed, listening as he shared regrets, wishes, insights gained too late. One night, he squeezed my hand and said quietly, "Emily, remember that this house is yours. It's more than property, it's your roots, your identity. Don't let anyone take that from you." I promised him, not fully grasping then how important that vow would become. His funeral, a quiet affair that felt coldly formal due to Patricia's precise arrangements, left me feeling isolated. The warmth of grief was lost in the formality of appearances. But that evening, alone in the quiet house that should have been mine, I allowed myself the brief luxury of tears, not just for my grandfather, but for the loss of my only true family connection. The lawyer's words from earlier today now resonated deeply in the quiet courtroom. The next steps would indeed be difficult. I was challenging not just Patricia's betrayal, but a lifetime of silent compliance to her emotional control. Even as I walked to my car, I felt the weight of my decision settling heavily on my shoulders. My phone buzzed, a text from my closest friend, Sarah, the only person who knew the truth of my complicated family dynamics. She wrote simply, "How did it go?" I answered, "It's begun." Sarah understood. She'd witnessed the subtle ways Patricia had undermined me, watched the quiet erosion of my confidence and self-worth. We met in college, bonding immediately over our shared love of art and quiet rebellion against familial expectations. Sarah had seen me at my lowest, had gently reminded me of my value when I forgot myself. Later that night, we sat in her small, comfortable kitchen, her 2 cats sleeping lazily nearby. She poured me tea and spoke softly. She said, "Emily, you're finally doing something for you. Not for your mother, not for appearances. That matters." I replied quietly, "I just wish it didn't have to come to this." She reached across the table, touching my hand gently. "You didn't create this conflict, Emily. Patricia did." Her words echoed softly, reinforcing my resolve. Sarah knew, perhaps better than anyone, how much this fight was costing me emotionally, yet she also saw the strength it was finally allowing me to claim. Days later, in preparation for the next court hearing, I sorted through paperwork my grandfather had meticulously organized before his death: deeds, letters, carefully annotated files. Amid the practical documents, one small envelope caught my attention, labeled in his careful handwriting, "For Emily." Inside was a single sheet of paper, a handwritten note in the same careful script. "Emily. Strength isn't found in the noise we make but in the silence we hold. Don't let others define you, not even Patricia. Especially not Patricia. Love always. Grandpa." The simplicity of his message strengthened my resolve even further. Patricia's betrayal was about more than property, it was the culmination of a lifetime spent trying to silence me, molding me into a version of herself she deemed acceptable. I finally understood that I wasn't fighting merely for my home but for the dignity of being truly myself, something Patricia had never allowed. That evening, as I carefully returned the note to its envelope, a sense of calm determination replaced my lingering doubts. My grandfather had always seen my strength clearly. Now it was time for Patricia to see it too. The next morning, I dressed deliberately, choosing clothes Patricia herself had criticized as too simple for important occasions. I met my lawyer at the courthouse, heart steady, hands calm. Today was about more than a legal battle, it was about stepping fully into myself, quietly, irrevocably. As Patricia arrived, her eyes met mine briefly. I saw uncertainty behind her carefully constructed mask, a tiny fracture in her perfect facade. My lawyer leaned over and whispered gently, "Are you ready?" I looked ahead, my voice steady, quiet, resolved. "Yes, I'm ready." Patricia's lawyer slid the photograph across the table toward me, his eyes carefully neutral, his voice smooth and practiced. My stomach tightened as I recognized my grandfather's familiar handwriting, the note I'd discovered only the night before, now twisted into evidence against me. Across from me, Patricia's face remained perfectly composed, yet her eyes betrayed a faint triumph she couldn't quite conceal. This was a new kind of manipulation, a subtle knife expertly aimed at my integrity, and it struck deeper than any open confrontation could. "Miss Hartley," her lawyer began softly, voice steeped in false sympathy, "are you aware that emotional distress claims are often viewed unfavorably by the court, especially given your mother's recent health concerns?" I met his gaze steadily, recognizing the tactic for what it was: guilt cloaked as compassion, manipulation wrapped in legal jargon. Patricia had spent a lifetime perfecting such methods, subtly eroding boundaries until compliance felt like the only option. Yet, something in me had shifted irreversibly, a quiet defiance born from the simple truth of my grandfather's words. I wasn't here to bend anymore. He continued, relentless in his calm, practiced cruelty. "Patricia is prepared to settle generously, Emily. A financial arrangement, perhaps a property of equivalent value elsewhere. Consider carefully, is holding on to a memory worth the damage to your relationship? The insinuation stung deeply, a transaction, the sale of my dignity in exchange for peace. But Patricia never understood that this wasn't merely about property. It was about control, about finally resisting her lifelong expectation that I would quietly acquiesce. The offer itself was a trap, disguised as reason. Even now, in this sterile room lined with polished wood and impersonal decor, Patricia sought to redefine me on her terms. I glanced at my lawyer, his eyes encouraging yet cautious, understanding the implications if I declined. To continue meant embracing the isolation Patricia was skillfully constructing around me, framing my resistance as selfishness, my rightful claim as greed. She knew exactly how to sever bonds without lifting a finger herself, letting others wield the blade. In the silence that stretched painfully between us, I remembered the countless times I'd stood quietly while Patricia shaped my narrative. At dinners, she'd introduce me with carefully edited facts, my career understated, my quiet independence recast as aloofness. Even at family gatherings, she casually belittled achievements she herself had once demanded. Yet this confrontation wasn't unexpected. It was simply the culmination of Patricia's lifelong habit of controlling those around her through carefully cultivated emotional leverage. To refuse her now was to face everything I'd feared most: isolation, judgment, and blame. But acceptance meant something worse: losing the core of myself, dissolving silently into her vision of who I should be. My lawyer cleared his throat gently, offering space for my response. I drew a slow breath, willing myself steady. I replied calmly, my grandfather's intentions were clear. His home, his legacy, these were meant for me. This isn't negotiable. Patricia's eyes hardened slightly, a flicker of something like surprise quickly masked by practiced indifference. She had always assumed I'd choose compliance over conflict, quiet acceptance over genuine autonomy. My resistance was not something she'd anticipated fully. Outside the courthouse, the weight of the confrontation lingered, pressing heavily on my chest as I walked through familiar streets that now felt strangely foreign. Isolation had always been my quiet companion, but Patricia had skillfully sharpened it into a weapon against me. Even in victory, the emotional cost was devastatingly real. Days passed under an increasingly heavy silence. Calls from mutual acquaintances trickled in, their voices laden with carefully masked curiosity. Each conversation carried undertones of judgment, subtle suggestions that my stance was somehow unreasonable or heartless. Patricia was quietly rebranding herself as the injured party, a narrative as familiar to me as my own breath. At work, my concentration faltered, the quiet whispers behind closed doors a stark reminder that Patricia's influence extended far beyond family gatherings. My carefully constructed professional persona, once a shield against her judgments, began showing fractures under the relentless pressure. Even Sarah's steadfast presence couldn't fully shield me from the subtle erosion Patricia had orchestrated. One evening, while I was sorting through paperwork at home, there was a gentle knock on my door. I opened it, surprised to find my Aunt Clara standing there, her expression carefully neutral, yet her eyes filled with quiet empathy. Clara had always stayed quietly on the periphery of family drama, her presence unobtrusive yet steady. We spoke quietly over cups of tea, her soft voice hesitant yet earnest. She said, "Emily, Patricia reached out. She's making this very difficult for you." I replied evenly, "She always does." Clara hesitated briefly, then reached into her purse, pulling out an envelope. She handed it to me carefully, her expression unreadable. She said softly, "You need to see this, Emily. It might change things." As she left, I opened the envelope, fingers trembling slightly. Inside were medical documents, official-looking papers stamped with the emblem of Patricia's doctor. The diagnosis printed clearly on the first page read, Stage 2 breast cancer. The date on the document was recent, far too recent to dismiss casually. My throat tightened painfully. Patricia's illness wasn't a lie, not a manipulative tactic this time. It was real, tangible, undeniable. Yet, her choice to keep this hidden, to weaponize even her own vulnerability against me, twisted the knife deeper than any prior betrayal. I sank slowly onto the couch, the weight of this revelation pressing heavily against me. The emotional complexity was suffocating, genuine concern mingling with bitter resentment. Patricia had turned even her illness into a strategic weapon, a final, devastating manipulation designed to undermine my resolve. And yet, beneath the swirl of confusion and anger, I felt a sharp clarity emerging. Patricia's choices didn't absolve her of responsibility, nor did her illness erase years of emotional manipulation. Still, her vulnerability, unexpected, unplanned, introduced a complexity I hadn't prepared for. Could I truly pursue justice when faced with the raw, undeniable reality of her condition? The quiet around me felt deafening as I stared at the documents, recognizing the choice before me as a defining moment. This was Patricia's most masterful manipulation yet, not because of its calculated cruelty, but because of its raw humanity. She presented me with a dilemma I couldn't resolve through logic alone, one that would require confronting something deeper, my own capacity for empathy, forgiveness, and strength. In the silence of that evening, holding those papers in my shaking hands, I knew my next move would determine far more than property rights or legal victories. It would define who I was, beyond Patricia's shadow, beyond the quiet strength my grandfather had instilled in me. The next step was mine alone to take. Grief and clarity don't often arrive hand in hand. But that night, holding my mother's diagnosis in one hand and my grandfather's letter in the other, something inside me solidified. Not sympathy. Not forgiveness. Just certainty. Patricia was sick. But I had never been confused about the nature of our relationship. Her illness didn't erase a lifetime of cold calculation, it only cast a harsher light on the lengths she was willing to go to maintain control, even while her own body betrayed her. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't moved by the reality of her condition, I was. But Patricia had never permitted tears in our house, not even when my father died. Crying was weakness. And weakness was an offense. So I learned to fold pain into composure. That habit didn't suddenly vanish with a scan result and a medical stamp. Still, I didn't sleep. I sat on the edge of my couch, light off, tea untouched. My mind drifted not to the illness, but to her strategy. That's what I couldn't shake. The way she had chosen to reveal her condition, through my aunt, in a sealed envelope, as if daring me to flinch. It wasn't a confession. It was a play. Another quiet dare wrapped in vulnerability. I wasn't naive. This was her final attempt to force me back into her control, using mortality now, rather than money or legacy. But there was one thing she hadn't counted on. I had stopped needing her approval. The next morning, I opened the file drawer in my hallway and began again. I went back to the beginning, my grandfather's will. The original notarized copy had been in my possession since his death, untouched, respected. But now I scrutinized every line like it was newly written. I noted clauses I hadn't given much attention to before, conditions, language about fiduciary responsibility, the specific wording about transfer of title. I cross-checked it against the sale documents from the house transaction, which I'd obtained during discovery. The inconsistencies weren't dramatic, but they were present, enough to reopen a line of inquiry. Next, I made a list. Names, dates, locations. Not of people I needed to confront, but of those Patricia had worked with, her real estate agent, her notary, even the bank representative who had co-signed the transfer. I wasn't chasing emotion anymore. I was tracing strategy. Her steps. Her pressure points. By afternoon, I was seated in a quiet corner booth at a downtown cafe across from an estate lawyer I'd been referred to. Her name was Lizette. Young, sharp, and uninterested in politeness. I liked her immediately. She said, "If you're serious about contesting the legitimacy of that sale, I need everything. Emails, phone records, any documentation you have from your grandfather's final weeks." I replied, "You'll have it by tonight." Her eyebrow lifted slightly. Not out of doubt. Out of recognition. She saw in me the thing Patricia had always refused to acknowledge, competence sharpened by restraint. By midnight, my kitchen table was covered in neatly labeled folders. I worked without music, without distraction, only the soft hum of my refrigerator keeping me company. I found the email chain between Patricia and the estate agent. At first glance, it was standard. But one line stood out, an offhand comment from the agent: "As discussed, I understand the house transfer won't be legally contested since your daughter signed off?" I hadn't. I never had. There was no such document. The next day, I met again with Lizette. She scanned the page quickly, then sat back and crossed her arms. She said, "That's either a fabricated signature or someone lied under oath." That was the first time I let myself imagine it, Patricia, forced to explain herself in a setting she couldn't control. No curated image, no emotional leverage. Just truth, sterile and public. Still, I knew that justice alone wasn't enough. If I wanted to truly reclaim what she'd taken, I had to dismantle the structure she'd built around herself, quietly, precisely. That began with the real estate agent. I called under the pretense of clarifying title history. We spoke for 20 minutes. She was polite, defensive, clearly uneasy. When I asked directly about my signature, there was a long pause. She said, "I was told it was a family matter." I assumed. Patricia assured me. I replied, "She assured you of something that doesn't exist." That silence spoke louder than anything she could have admitted. It wasn't rage that moved me forward. It was the knowledge that Patricia had always operated in shadows, assuming no one would challenge her. But I wasn't 12 anymore, seeking approval for a piano recital she didn't attend. I was a woman. Capable. Prepared. The evidence came together quickly. The timeline, the communications, the misrepresentation of consent. But what surprised me most were the letters I found tucked inside an old shoebox buried in my hallway closet. They weren't mine. They were my grandfather's, written to Patricia. Handwritten, dated over several years. Quiet, pleading attempts to reach her. One in particular stopped me cold. Dated 2 years before his death. Patricia. Emily sees you more clearly than you realize. One day she'll need to protect herself from you. When that time comes, I hope you'll choose integrity over pride. If you don't, she will stand alone, but she will stand tall. You taught her control. I taught her truth. I pray she remembers which one lasts longer. That night, I didn't sleep again. But it wasn't anxiety that kept me up, it was resolve. Patricia's illness had changed nothing fundamental. The house was still stolen. The promise broken. But it had added one final weight to the balance, a truth she could no longer outrun. The court date was rescheduled for the following week. Lizette and I met again to review our position. She laid out our points with surgical clarity. She said, "You know she may use her illness in court. Emotionally, visually. That might sway perception." I nodded. "I know." Lizette leaned forward. "Do you still want to proceed?" My answer came without hesitation. Yes. I wasn't seeking punishment. I was seeking truth. And no diagnosis, real or weaponized, could change the fact that Patricia had violated something sacred. Not the house. Not even the will. But the bond of trust that should exist between mother and daughter. On the morning of the hearing, I stood in front of the mirror for a long time. I didn't wear black. I didn't wear anything sharp or austere. I chose a soft navy blouse and a gray skirt, quiet strength, not aggression. I pinned my grandfather's old cufflink, the one he'd given me before his final hospital stay, onto the inside of my sleeve. A silent reminder. When I entered the courthouse, Patricia was already there. She sat straight-backed, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her scarf was pulled close around her neck, her complexion pale. She didn't look at me. But I watched her. And I saw it, the fear. Not of illness. Not of death. But of exposure. Of losing control. The judge called us forward. And I stepped quietly into the light. The courtroom felt colder than it should have. Not physically, but in that emotional way that settles over a space when everyone inside knows something unspoken is about to surface. Patricia's lawyer rose first, his tone deliberate, smooth, carefully calibrated to strike a balance between sympathy and plausible doubt. He leaned heavily on the medical records. Referred to Patricia's condition as delicate. Repeated the word compassion more than once. He implied that the legal action was not just unnecessary but cruel, a daughter punishing her ill mother in public. I listened without blinking. When it was Lizette's turn, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't perform. She moved with quiet confidence, grounding her argument in facts so immovable they rang louder than any theatrics ever could. She said, "We're not here to discuss illness. We're here to examine intent, legality, and the boundaries of trust." I watched Patricia as Lizette spoke. Her face didn't move, but her eyes flickered, barely, but enough. She had underestimated Lizette, and she had underestimated me. I was called to testify midway through the hearing. I stood, adjusted my blouse, and walked slowly toward the witness seat. My palms weren't sweating. My heartbeat was steady. For the first time in a very long time, I felt fully inside my own body. Lizette asked me about the will. About the house. About the promise my grandfather had made me. I answered without embellishment, just truth, piece by piece. When she asked if I had ever signed any consent to sell the home, I replied firmly, no. Never. Patricia avoided my eyes. When her lawyer began his cross-examination, the tone changed. He framed each question with soft suggestion, not accusation. But the message was clear: I was overreaching. Emotional. Unreasonable. He said, "Would you describe your relationship with your mother as close?" I replied, "No. It was never close." He nodded slowly, then asked, "So you were estranged?" I paused just long enough. I said, "I was compliant." "That's not closeness." He blinked, briefly thrown. The judge glanced up. Even Patricia's lawyer seemed to understand in that moment, this wasn't going to be the narrative they'd hoped to sculpt. He moved on quickly, asking about the letter I'd found. Tried to suggest that its emotional tone indicated confusion on my grandfather's part. He said, "Do you think your grandfather might have been conflicted? Concerned about family harmony more than legalities?" I replied, "He was concerned about Patricia. Not about confusion." He knew exactly what he wanted. There was a pause then. A noticeable shift. He tried again, "You understand this case is creating emotional distress for your mother?" I said quietly, "She has lived her entire life managing perception. This is the first time she's being asked to account for truth." He hesitated, looked down at his notes, then waved the cross-examination off. Patricia took the stand after me. She walked slowly, deliberately. Her scarf was loose at the collar now. A small signal of vulnerability. She spoke with her usual restraint, but there was an edge in her voice, a clipped precision meant to sound composed but that betrayed something closer to fear. She said, "I believed I was doing what was best for everyone involved." She said, "The house held painful memories. It wasn't practical to keep it." She said, "Emily has always been strong." I thought she understood. There was no apology. No admission. Just soft condescension buried in polished words. Lizette's questions were surgical. She asked, "Did you inform your daughter in writing or in person that the house was to be sold?" Patricia answered, "No. I didn't believe it was necessary." She asked, "Did you obtain any legal waiver from Emily?" Patricia said, "It was a verbal agreement." Lizette said, "There is no record of that agreement. There is no signature. Are you aware that per your father's will, any sale required Emily's written consent?" Patricia paused. Her jaw tightened just slightly. She said, "I don't recall the specifics." That was the moment I felt it, like the first fracture in a frozen lake. The soundless crack running beneath everything. The judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. We will recess for lunch. I walked past Patricia without looking at her. But I felt her eyes. For the first time, they didn't hold anger. They held recognition. She finally saw me. Not as her daughter. Not as the manageable extension of herself. But as a woman with boundaries. And power. In the hallway, Sarah was waiting. She hadn't come into the courtroom. But her presence outside meant more to me than anything happening inside. We sat on a bench, sharing silence the way only old friends can. She said, "You're doing something I don't think I could." I replied, "You would. If it had to be done." She smiled sadly. "But it hurts, doesn't it?" I looked down at my hands, folded in my lap. More than I expected. We returned after lunch. The judge asked for closing statements. Lizette stood, quiet, unhurried. She said, "This case is not about vengeance. It's about accountability. It's about honoring a will that was written with clarity and executed in trust. That trust was broken." Patricia's lawyer emphasized illness again. Family bonds. The need for compassion. But something had shifted in the room. A weight had lifted. The judge announced that he would review the evidence and deliver a ruling within the week. No dramatic verdict. Just a promise of deliberation. As we exited the courtroom, Patricia walked past me without speaking. For a second, I thought she might. But her lips pressed into a thin line, and she kept going. Lizette touched my elbow gently. "We've done what we needed to." I nodded. But deep down, I knew the courtroom wasn't the end. The legal battle might conclude in paperwork and official rulings. But the emotional reckoning, between Patricia and me, was still unfinished. And something told me it was coming sooner than I expected. There was no celebration when the verdict came. Just an email, quiet and clinical, stating that the sale had been deemed unlawful. The court ruled in my favor. The property would revert to my name. Patricia would be required to cover legal costs. It was everything we'd asked for, and nothing I could feel. I stared at the screen for a long time. The words blurred slightly, not from tears but from something heavier. Closure wasn't as clean as I thought it would be. Justice doesn't always arrive with relief. Sometimes it just lands. Like a final stone placed on a grave you never asked to dig. Lizette called later that afternoon, her voice calm. She said, "It's a solid ruling. No room for appeal." I replied, "Thank you." She hesitated before adding, "You handled this with more restraint than most. I've seen people unravel during less." But I didn't feel strong. I felt hollow. It wasn't victory that I was reckoning with. It was loss. And not of a house, of something older and deeper. A hope I'd quietly carried far longer than I realized. The hope that one day Patricia might see me as enough. As whole. As hers. A week passed before the paperwork finalized. I didn't call Patricia. I didn't need to. She knew. Her silence was confirmation enough. She had no further moves, and I had no appetite for gloating. The house was quiet when I returned. Dust had settled in corners. The air was stale with months of vacancy. I moved slowly through each room, fingertips grazing old memories. The kitchen still smelled faintly of rosemary and lemon, as if my grandfather had just finished cooking one of his quiet Sunday dinners. The upstairs hallway creaked in all the same places. My old bedroom, stripped of furniture, echoed in a way that made me feel 10 years old again. Alone, but safe. I didn't rush to fill the space. I lived in my apartment downtown, surrounded by the familiar rhythms of my adult life. This house was something else. A place of reckoning. A place to hold stillness. I didn't need it for comfort. I needed it to remember who I was before I learned to shrink. In the weeks that followed, I handled the logistics, property transfers, back taxes Patricia had left unpaid, small repairs to undo the cosmetic staging from the sale. I did it methodically. No emotion. Just the work of reclaiming something stripped from me. Sarah came by once with lunch and 2 folding chairs. We sat on the porch in the late afternoon sun, the kind that slants low and soft, turning even broken things gold. She said, "Do you think she'll reach out?" I replied, "No. She's not built for repair." She nodded slowly. "And if she does?" I looked out at the yard, overgrown but still familiar. "I don't know." The truth was, I wasn't angry anymore. I had passed through that. What remained was something quieter, more permanent. A shift in the way I saw her. The power she once held was gone, replaced by something sadder, irrelevance. But life didn't stop. Work resumed. Projects piled up. Friends asked careful questions, which I answered with abbreviated honesty. People say family is everything. But that's only true if family behaves like family. One evening in early spring, I received a letter. Handwritten. No return address. I knew the script before I unfolded the page. Patricia wrote. "Emily. You got what you wanted. I hope you find peace in it. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't need it. Just know that I did what I thought was best, even if you see it as theft. I never understood you. And you never understood what it meant to be me. Patricia." It wasn't an apology. Not even close. But it was something I hadn't expected, acknowledgement. A reluctant, distorted one, but still. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer. I wouldn't answer. There was nothing left to say. But I wouldn't destroy it either. Some things aren't meant to be fixed. Only faced. Months passed. I hired a contractor to begin restoring the house, not to sell, but to return it to what it had once been under my grandfather's care. I kept the original floors. The crown molding. The rose bushes in the back garden, long wilted, were replaced with new ones from a local nursery. I didn't invite anyone to see the work. It wasn't for display. It was an act of preservation, not performance. Late one afternoon, I stood in the dining room, now freshly painted, and imagined the quiet dinners we used to have. Just me and my grandfather. No judgment. No performance. Just peace. In that moment, I realized something I hadn't before. I wasn't rebuilding the house. I was rebuilding memory. And in doing so, I was untangling my past from hers. I still haven't heard from Patricia again. I suspect I never will. And I no longer scan my inbox or flinch when the phone rings. That thread is cut. Gently, but with finality. But just last week, as I pulled into the driveway, I saw a small envelope taped to the front door. Inside was a single sentence, typed this time and signed. "You are stronger than you realize." I don't know who left it. But I didn't need to. Some endings arrive without applause, without confrontation. Just silence, and the steady, quiet certainty that something is over. I stood at the kitchen sink one morning, hands wrapped around a warm mug, watching a robin gather twigs outside the window. The garden had started blooming again, modestly, unevenly, but with insistence. The rose bushes, once bare and broken, now carried the soft beginnings of color. I hadn't planted them for beauty. I'd planted them because it's what my grandfather would have done. There was something deeply honest about watching things grow back without fanfare. No audience, no permission, just the quiet momentum of life continuing, even after what was rooted had been torn up. I didn't respond to the typed note left on my door. I didn't ask questions. Whoever had written it, Patricia, Clara, a neighbor moved by rumor, it didn't matter. What mattered was that I didn't need it to be true. I already knew I was stronger. Not in the way people talk about resilience as survival, but in the quieter way that comes from refusing to become someone else's version of you. Some days, I still drove past her apartment. Not to check on her. Not even to see her. Just because it reminded me of how small her world had become. 4 walls, perfectly curated. No room for error. No space for real grief. Or growth. I never saw her again. Clara wrote once. A short email saying Patricia had begun treatments but wasn't doing well. There were complications. She was mostly alone. I stared at the message for a long time. Not with guilt. Not even relief. Just stillness. I didn't reply. There was nothing in me left to offer her. Forgiveness had never been the goal. And maybe that was the greatest shift. I wasn't looking to make peace with her. I was learning to make peace with myself. The girl I'd been, the woman I became, and the decisions that had carved the shape of both. Reclaiming the house hadn't fixed anything. It hadn't returned the years or repaired the damage. But it had done something quieter, more lasting. It had returned me to myself. One afternoon, I found an old camcorder in the attic. It still worked. I plugged it into an adapter and watched fragments of my childhood flash across the screen. Christmas mornings. A birthday party. My father lifting me into the air while I screamed with laughter. Patricia, younger, in the background, always poised, always distant. Then a clip I hadn't remembered, my grandfather, in the garden, coaxing a tomato plant through a trellis, smiling softly as I skipped into frame. He looked at the camera and said, not to anyone in particular, some things take time. And quiet. You have to give them space to find the sun. I paused the screen and just sat with that. I hadn't known how much I needed to hear his voice again until I heard it. I hadn't known how much space I'd finally claimed until I saw it. I didn't erase Patricia. She still lived in the house, in small ways. The pattern of the tiles she'd chosen. The grooves on the banister she used to polish obsessively. But the air was different now. Warmer. Mine. Sometimes Sarah visited on weekends. She brought her sketchpad and we'd sit on the porch drinking tea. We didn't talk much about the trial anymore. That chapter had closed. But she did say once. She said, "You didn't just win, Emily. You changed." I replied, "I think I finally let go of something I didn't realize I was holding." Letting go wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a breakdown or a final scream. It was more like exhaling after holding your breath for years. The kind of breath that shakes a little on its way out. I kept the house, but I didn't move in permanently. It wasn't meant to be my prison or my monument. Just a place I could return to. A place where the roots were still mine. Eventually, I started renting it out. To a quiet couple with a toddler and a golden retriever. I didn't tell them its history. I didn't need to. The house would build new stories now, ones that didn't belong to me. I left one thing behind for them, a rosebush I'd planted on the west side of the garden, just under the bedroom window. I tied a small tag to it, for patience. And beginnings. Back in my apartment, I opened the drawer where I kept Patricia's letter. I reread it once, then folded it away again. Not out of anger. Just boundaries. Some things are meant to be put to rest without being buried. Sometimes people ask if I regret it, taking her to court. Losing whatever thread of family we might have had left. And I tell them this, you can love someone and still not let them destroy you. You can grieve what never was, and still choose not to carry it forward. The legacy I wanted wasn't the house. It was the quiet. The right to stand still and not be moved. And in the end, I kept that. All of it.